Okay, this week's Torah portion, Parashat Bo, we finish off the plagues. We begin the process of redemption as the Israelites, the children of Israel, will leave Egypt on the way to the promised land. Not as quick a journey as they were anticipating in this moment, but that's it. And you know, we're not going to talk about inaugurations, and we're not going to talk about political transitions or whatever. I mean, there's what to talk about, certainly in relates to Egypt and the political realities of Egypt and anti-Semitism. But let's leave that for now. We'll talk Torah, and we're going to jump in. And what I wanted to focus on for just a short while today is the ninth plague, which is the plague of darkness. I'm fascinated by this plague. It's a brief, it's a succinct plague. It's it's very difficult to understand exactly what the plague is. After all, what is darkness? We're asking very serious existential questions about light and darkness. And of course, we all embrace the metaphor of darkness, which is evil. But here, the darkness was actually performing a very positive function. Is darkness a thing unto itself, or is it simply the absence of light? And we're going to look at some commentators who are going to grapple with these very interesting questions, as well as we'll see also an alternate form of darkness, which doesn't do away with the light, but still there is darkness felt there. We're going to see that in just a moment. So I'm going to share the source sheet with you. Here we go. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, the Lord said to Moses, Netei yadcha lashamayim, hold out your arm toward the sky, vihi choshech al eretz Mitzrayim, and there will be, and we're going to go back to that word, there will be, let there be darkness on the land of Egypt. I'll interject here. That phrase, let there be darkness, is it reminiscent of anything? Vihi choshech, think about creation, but in creation, it was Vayhi Or, let there be light. And here that same phrase, and we're going to look at the commentators, you're going to notice this, that same phrase is used, let there be darkness. On the land of Egypt, Vayamesh Choshech, a darkness, as the translation here is, a darkness. The word, I don't know if you're familiar with the word mamash. Mamash means reality. In yeshiva, we'll often say that to underscore a point. It's mamish, the greatest thing ever. It's really very much so. This pizza is mamish delicious. It's really, I mean, there are 1,000 examples one could give, but mamash, the word limamesh is to bring into realization, vayamesh choshech, that darkness will be real. It can be touched, as the translation here is. Vayet Moshe et yado. Moses then stretches out his arm, just as God told Moses to do. Remember here it says netei yadcha, stretch out your arm. Vayet Moshe et yado. That Moshe does exactly what God says. Al hashamayim, towards the heavens. Vayehi choshech afela b'chol eretz Mitzrayim shloshet yamim. And here we're going to have an additional word added. The word for darkness is choshech. And then it adds this word afela, which has the sense of darkness, of ephel, of something that's so deep and black, and one can't see any color, any light in it in the entire land of Egypt. Shloshet yamim, for a period of 3 days. Lo ra'u ish et achiv. One man could not see his brother. They couldn't see each other, essentially. Velo kamu ish mitachtav shloshet yamim, and they couldn't get up from their place for 3 days. Ulachol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshvotam. But for all of the children of Israel, there was light where they lived. There was light where they lived. Okay, and that's essentially the plague. So look at Rashi. So what's the timeline? The timeline is, so what Rashi is going to address in the first place is the fact that in 2 consecutive verses, we have this phrase, shloshet yamim, 3 days. Why do I need to mention that twice? It could have left out in the first verse, and then it would have been Moses held out his arm towards the sky, and thick darkness descended upon all the land of Egypt. People couldn't see each other, and for 3 days, no one could get up. Right? That's what I would have expected. Why is there this repetition of 3 days? Because as Rashi says, that actually the plague was 6 days. It was 3 days and 3 days. 3 days of, I'm trying to use a word other than lighter, of easier plague, not a lighter plague, but an easier plague of darkness, and 3 then subsequent days of a more serious plague of darkness. So Rashi says, Choshech shalofa shalo ra'u ish et achiv otan shlosha yamim, that they couldn't see each other for 3 days. Ve'od shlosha yamim acherim, and there were an additional 3 days, a choshech muchpalaz, of even darker, of darkness that was added to this. Shalo kamu ish mitachtav. So these are 2 periods. Look at this. Lo ra'u ish et achiv, they couldn't see each other. That's 3 days. They can't see. Velo kamu ish mitachtav, and they can't get up. That's an additional 3 days of more severe darkness. That's arresting them. That's paralyzing them. Look at this. Look what happened. Yoshev einu yachol lamod. If a person was sitting, they couldn't stand. V'omed ein yachol leshev. But if they were standing when the plague set up, they couldn't sit down. They were frozen in place. That's what happened. V'lama hevi alehem choshech. So the big question, the $1 million question: why this plague? Why darkness? So Rashi is going to offer a few reasons. Number one, because Shehayu b'Yisrael ba'oto hador, in that generation amongst the Israelites, there were rishaim, there were evil people. Velo hayu rotzim latzeit. These were the people who said, I don't want to leave. I'm fine here. Things are okay. Yes, we're a slave people. Things are okay. It's worse out there. Umetu b'shlosha yimei afela. And those people died in the 3 days of deep darkness. Kadei shelo yiru mitzrim b'mapalatam v'yomru afheim lo kin kamonu. So that the Egyptians wouldn't see and say, oh, the Israelites are being plagued also, so it can't be their God because they're victims also of this plague. No, the darkness was there so that those Israelites who needed to die, who needed to perish because they were evil, were able to perish, and the Egyptians wouldn't make any assumptions based on their death that the God of the Hebrews is not the God that was bringing about the plague. So that's number one. There was darkness so that God could punish the evil Israelites as well. Number two, Shechipsu Yisrael, so that the Israelites could walk around. Vera'u et klehem, and they could see the nice vessels that the Egyptians had. So the Israelites were able to finally look around freely and look, well, into people's homes, presumably, and see what the nice things that the Egyptians had. Uchsheyatsu. And when finally, after this plague and after the next plague, when finally the Israelites are ready to leave the land of Egypt, kshayu shoalim mehen, and they would ask the Egyptians for payment. As many of the commentators say, why did the Israelites borrow nice things from the Egyptians? This was payment for the 210 years of slave labor. Give us our reparations. Give us our due. And what would the Egyptians say? Vayu shoalim mehen, vayu omrin, and the Egyptians would say, Ein biyadenu klum. We don't have the money. We can't pay you reparations for the slave labor. We don't have it. And the Israelites could say, Ani ra'itiv beveitcha. No, I saw it in your house. Uvmakom plonihu. If you're looking for that nice silver platter that I'm asking for, it's on the 3rd shelf in the cabinet. It's right there. I know where it is. Not only I know you have it, but I know exactly where it is. So that's Rashi. Rashi says that the plague of darkness was 2 subsequent period of 3 days. One regular darkness they couldn't see. The other, a thicker darkness where they couldn't move. And why darkness? Number one, so that God could punish the evil ones amongst the Israelites. And number two, so that the Israelites could have a glance at ultimately what would be theirs upon the Exodus, what the Egyptians would then give to them. Okay, any questions?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
I'm wondering, in a situation like this, where Rashi is getting his ideas of, is this from Midrash, or do we know any idea of sources?
I heard recently somebody say, why is Rashi the greatest? Why is he the number one commentator of all times? And they said really two things, two attributes to Rashi. Number one, he's succinct. He doesn't go on and on and on like many of the other commentators can and do. Rashi always short. Number two is that Rashi rarely says something of his own. He always quotes it and he attributes where he gets it from. So here you can see the parentheses. It says Shmot Rabbah, a compilation of Midrash, where Rashi is getting this from. There are books and books and books that are written on Rashi's sources, on where his sources are. We actually learn interesting textual nuances from source. Sometimes Rashi might have a different version or a different language of the Midrash than we have in our compilation of the Midrash. So we'll know what Rashi was looking at in the in the 11th century. So yeah, this happens to be from Midrash Rabbah, which is a primary compilation of Midrash, but Rashi will quote from all different Midrashic compilations. And Rashi didn't quote these parentheses weren't written by Rashi, but by some editor at some point who said, who asked your question, where is Rashi getting this? Oh, let's find this in the Midrash. It's Shmot Rabbah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Okay. Let's look at the Ibn Ezra. I'm sharing this because I found this fascinating. The Ibn Ezra on the same verse, on the verse that said that Moshe outstretched his arm about the plague of darkness, he says that V'lo yadu, what were the Egyptians saying? Oi, we're suffering for darkness for how long? For 3 days, 6 days. Well, how did they know how long it was if it was darkness? How do you measure time if you don't have the sun and if you don't have watches and if you don't? So the Egyptians could just say, oh, this was a long day, but maybe it was 6 days. How would they know? Who's keeping time? That's a good question. So Ibn Ezra says, V'lo yadu shahayu gimel yamin. They didn't know that it was 3 days. El al pi Israel shayalem or, because only the Israelites were telling them, because the Israelites had the light, so therefore they were telling them this. I thought of this. I have one of my kids. He was constantly asking, "What time is it? What time is it? What time is it?" And we're saying, "Go look at the." She wants to know because we have our phones and so we bought her a watch. So that she could have the time. And now her other siblings constantly ask her, what time is it? What time is it? What time is it? So one person, and we don't think about this, but having the time or controlling the time, I used to never know what time it was. I don't wear a watch, principally. Sometimes I will on occasion, but as a regular basis, I don't wear a watch. And before the era of smartphones and cell phones, I really never knew what time it was. And occasionally I'll ask, but you develop a sense of time. And people who always have a phone at arm's reach can tell you exactly what time it is at all times, but ultimately probably aren't developing the same sense of knowing how much time has passed in any given time. So anyway, this is the Egyptians who didn't know how long the plague was, but the Israelites were telling them, by the way, your sun has not risen. The sun has not risen for you. You're in darkness for now for 3 days. And then the Ibn Ezra says something fascinating, which I don't know what to make of it, but here it is. I'm sharing it with you because I found it really interesting how he connects his own experiences to the observation of the verses. He says, "V'hine bayam okyanus." That should be a samach, not a mem. That's an error. But hine bayam okyanus, which means the Atlantic Ocean. Yavo choshech av, a thick darkness will come. Shalo yuchal adam lahafrish, a person, presumably a sailor on the water, won't be able to tell the difference bein yom uvein laila, between day and night. V'yamod ze lifamim chamisha yamim, and a person could could be there for 5 days. I'm sorry, v'yamod ze, and this darkness could be there even for 5 days, and you wouldn't know the passage of time. Va'ani hayiti sham pa'amim rabot, and I was there many times. The Ibn Ezra says I was on the Atlantic Ocean many times. So I don't know enough about the Ibn Ezra to know why he was sailing on the Atlantic so many times, or why he was in the great sea so many times. But I just found this a fascinating thing that he was connecting it to the reality. Now, I think of this in terms of now that we have the luxuries of travel that they never had. The Ibn Ezra, or Rashi, in medieval times could never imagine visiting the Arctic Circle, and could never imagine going to a place of the midnight sun or of darkness, where darkness settles in for months at a time and the sun doesn't rise above a certain level. So that's it. Simply is his own experience and connecting his own experiences. And Rashi and Ibn Ezra also, I'll mention, could never have imagined the questions that Ilan Ramon of blessed memory had to ask when going up to space and asking, when is Shabbat? If I'm not on Earth and we don't have the normal cycle of the sun, Shabbat is a very, we'll call it geocentric concept. You need to be on Earth for the passage of 7 days to really affect you. So what do? What time? When's Yom Kippur? If you're in space and passing, 12 days a second or whatever the speed, I don't know what it is, but it's a very exaggerated speed of that time passes by as we might measure it. Then how do you observe all these geocentric concepts? Judaism was meant to be lived on Earth, not in space. So I found it fascinating that the Ibn Ezra is finding, at least from his experience, a time in which he didn't see the sunrise and sunset as we might normally do in the regular course of our lives, and connected that to the plague of darkness. Any questions? Okay, I wanted to share one verse, and then we'll get to the meat of our discussion, the Chasam Sofer and the Rav Hirsch. So the verse, and I'm sharing this because in 105th chapter of Tehillim, part of it recounts God's wonders, recounts what God did for us when we were in Egypt. And it's going to mention the plague of darkness. Shalach Moshe Avdo Aaron Asher Bacharbo. He sent a servant Moses, Aaron, he chose him. Samu bam divrei ototav, and he performed his signs among them. Umoftim be'eretz Cham, in the land of Cham. Remember Cham, one of the sons of Noach, and Mitzrayim descended from him. So he placed all of his wonders in the land of Egypt, referring to Shalach Choshech. So this is what the next Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg in the next Haktav HaKabal, the next commentary, is going to refer to this verse where it says Shalach Choshech. He sent darkness. He's going to say, how can you send darkness? What does that mean? Is darkness a thing that you can put in the mail and send? What is it? Vayachshech, and it became dark. Velo maru et devaro, did they not defy his word? So listen to what the Ketava Kabbalah says. He says, milat yehi. Remember we said vayehi, yehi or, let there be light. Vayehi choshech, let there be darkness. That word, let there be, mora al havaya umitziut davarma. It shows, it teaches, it infers the concept of havaya, of existence, something that exists, davarma, something that is. The ein zenofel al choshech halayla. That can't be describing the darkness of night, because the darkness of night is shehu heder or levad. That it's only the absence of light. It's not a thing. The darkness at night is not a thing that one can have, or one can send, or one can bring into existence. It simply is the absence of light. Because this word to be, let there be, isn't mentioned, and when it describes the Genesis story, the Bereshit story, that word is not there. This darkness in Egypt was something that was so wondrous. Shaluach me'otzar za'am, that was sent from the storehouse of anger, of wrath. Lahanish bo risha'im, to punish the evil ones. Nichtav etzlo yehi. That darkness, that special darkness, was written yehi, let there be. V'zeh shebe'er hamishorer, and that's what the Mishorer, which is the word for the one who wrote Tehillim, the Mishorer, the poet, the songwriter. He wrote Shalach Choshech Ve'ash, what we saw above, send darkness and let it be dark. And it was very dark. Al Heder Lo Yupol Milat Shalach, on absence, meaning absence of light, you wouldn't say send darkness, you would say remove the light. We wouldn't say send darkness. Lamadnu, this teaches us Shenishtana HaChoshech Hazeh, that this darkness was different. Manishtana, right? Manishtana halayla hazeh, manishtana hachoshech hazeh. That this darkness was different. Mikol hamachshechim hanoda'im lo, from any darkness that's known to us. V'haya mishamesh kamo afela shelo ho'ila lahem shemesh v'yareach v'nerot lahagia choshcham. That this kind of darkness, whatever they tried, the sun, the moon, candles, can't dispel this. This is such a deep darkness. It's actually a thing that extinguishes all light. It's not the absence of light, but this darkness was something that was much more. It was much more real. Okay, so we're understanding a little bit about the darkness. Rashi, the Ibn Ezra, the Ketava Kabbalah, all with their comments on what this darkness is, how long it lasts, why it's there, and what the unique nature of this darkness is. There are two very interesting questions that emerge from the commentaries that I never thought of before. One was what we saw before. I found the Ibn Ezra's question fascinating. How did the Egyptians know that that 3 days had passed if they don't have a son? I thought that was an interesting question. It never occurred to me before. And the next interesting question came from the Chasam Sofer, right? Who we've been studying. And the Chasam Sofer asked the question, which I think is a pretty straightforward question, and it never occurred to me before. And I'm ashamed it never occurred. It's a logical question in the plague of darkness, which is, if darkness was the objective, how could God have done it differently and perhaps easier? Right? That's his question. And listen to the specific. He said, "Ze haya nes nifla ha'olam." This was an amazing miracle. Ha'olam nifla. Ha'olam choshech ba'ad hamitzrim. The world was dark for the Egyptians. Ve'he'ir liYisrael. And there was light for Israel. V'yesh lahaksho. One can ask the following. God, parenthetically, God doesn't do miracles. God doesn't waste miracles. Every miracle is necessary. So here's the question. Ma tzorech l'nes hazeh. Why did we need this miracle? Halo yachol lahakot t'mitzrim b'sanurim u'lahakotam einehem. God could have struck the Egyptians with sanurim, is actually linguistically, I believe, connected to the English word snares. God could have struck the Egyptians in some way, ulahakot einehem, and to dim their eyes, velo yechshach or olam, and then the light would never be made dark. Meaning, the question is, why did God have to bring darkness into the world? Why couldn't God just make the Egyptians blind? Right? Or even if temporarily, that was the plague, to temporarily blind the Egyptians. Why do you need darkness if God could have just blinded them? Right? It's a very good question. And keep in mind, we've already experienced the plague of boils, meaning it's not like the Egyptians' bodies are off limit and we're about to have the death of the firstborn. It's not like God is limited in what God is willing to do in terms of these plagues. God could have very easily altered the eyes of the Egyptians so that they couldn't see. Why do I need darkness? Right? Anyone else thought of this question? Had you? This to me was a great question. It's a very good question. I never thought of it before. So here's his answer. And to understand his answer, I believe it's rooted in ancient science, which believed in the humors of the body. And basically what he's going to explain is that essentially, I think the way I understand what he's going to say is what I think he's going to say is that the body, basically the humors of the body act as almost a battery for the body. And there's a limited amount of energy that these humors are putting out, and they are basically powering the different senses of the body, okay? So here's what he says. V'nir ali ki ha-iver, a blind person, marviach b'sha'ar chushav, benefits in their other senses. A person who has one sense absent will then experience an increased sensitivity in the other senses. Ki heinika hara'ui lahamshich la'ayin, because that which was basically drawn out of the body's battery, which was intended to power the eyes, is then going to be redistributed to the other senses. I don't know the science behind this. I'm not sure, but the concept is basically like the body is running on a battery, and if the eyes are turned off, that means that there's just more power to go to the other senses, and that's why they're more sensitive. That's what the Chasam Sofer is saying. Okay. Aval hayoshev b'choshech, but a person who's sitting in darkness, ve'enav pekuchot, but they can see, their eyes can see. The only problem is it's dark. What happens then? You drain the batteries. It's not that there's more batteries to go to the other senses. It's that because the person can see, but they're in darkness, it means that they're exhausting the batteries, that the eyes are working constantly trying to see, and therefore everything is going to be dimmer. And therefore they're draining the body's battery. I think it's a fantastic thought. I never came across this before. Hare koach harut mishamesh, so the power of vision is working. Ela she'ein ha'avir me'irlo, but the air is not illuminating for me. The environment's not illuminating. The adarabba, and it's actually the opposite of the other case. Motzi koachru toharbe, that the vision, the power of the vision is going to be, it's going to be using a lot of energy. Because he's sitting in darkness and his eyes are expecting to see. Nimsa ena ro'eh, therefore, and what ultimately results from this is that he can't see. V'gam chushav ena marvichim, and therefore his other senses are not benefiting from this. Adarabba mafsidim, they're actually losing. And so what he's describing, and I think this is fantastic, he's describing this experience of sensory exhaustion that the Egyptians were experiencing. That it wasn't just that they couldn't see, it was that they were trying, and if it were just so that they couldn't see, God could have blinded them. No, it was that the experience of sitting in the dark and trying so desperately to see was exhausting all of their powers. And so they couldn't hear as well, and they couldn't feel as well, and they couldn't smell as well, because everything was just trying to compensate. We were trying to make right what was wrong. I can't see, I can't see, I can't see. And as opposed to simply blinding them, and therefore they would have been able to manage somehow in the absence of light. But no, this was much more. This was draining their batteries, their sensory batteries. Any questions or comments? That's the Chasam Sofer. I think this is fantastic. I was really excited to read this Chasam Sofer.
I have a question.
A very good question. Yeah, Esther.
I have a question here. The darkness was after a series of previous plagues, and it was going to be succeeded by something else, which was even worse. Now, maybe this is a metaphorical darkness where the Israelites were in darkness for all those years that they were enslaved in Egypt, I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And now God was putting a darkness on the Egyptians in preparation along the way of the plagues. This would be one of them, to make them understand maybe or empathize, whether they did or didn't, I don't know, with the darkness that the Israelites have been living.
Yeah, look,
And
you're touching on the biblical concept of what we call midah keneged midah, measure for measure. And there's always
lowering their each time they put each time a new plague happened, they lower their sensitivity to their own life.
Right.
Begin to get used to, or they don't get used to it, but that something's coming and we got to prepare. So the darkness is maybe to make them understand what kind of darkness other people were going through.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that's a major part of all of the plagues, is to sensitize them to what had been happening for the last few centuries, and to wake them up to the crime that ultimately their society was committing. I think that's beautiful.
I like how the Chatam Sofer sort of explains why lo kamu ish mitachtav. Like it's almost like a reason.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Like it was so dark that they couldn't get up because all their senses were diminished.
Because they were exhausted from just trying to see. Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I enjoyed that.
Yeah, thank you for connecting that last dot. I didn't do that, but you did. Thank you. All right, let's jump forward. We're going to look at Rav Hirsch, and I'm going back to the previous plague for this, but I'm not really leaving darkness, and we'll see why. So the previous plague before this is arbe, is locusts, right? So fortunately, there are ways to remember the order of the plagues from the Passover Seder. So the last set is ba'achav, bet being barad, which is hail, aleph being arbe, which is locusts, chet being choshech, which is darkness, and then the last bet being makat bechorot, the firstborn. Okay, that's the dipping the finger and saying the tzach, right? So that's the last set. So we have locust, darkness, and firstborn are the last three plagues. So this is the last plague. And listen to the way the Torah describes it. So Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh. Right? God has said, how long are you going to refuse to humble yourself? Let my people go so that they worship me. Because if you refuse to send my nation, I'm going to bring locusts onto your land, okay, within your boundaries. So this is going to be the interesting phrase. It's going to cover. So here it's the surface of the land. That's the way they translate it. But in the Hebrew, ein haaretz is like ein, the eye of the land. It's going to cover the eye of the land. I'm going to talk about what that is. Velo yuchal lirot et haaretz, right? Did you know that there was darkness before there was darkness? That they weren't going to be able to see before darkness. It's not that they couldn't see anything during darkness, but during the plague of locusts, they couldn't see the land. Va'achal et yeter hat pleta, and they're going to devour these locusts, devour everything. Anisheret lachem min habarat, anything that was still left over from the hail that the hail hadn't killed, any produce that the locusts are going to come in and finish off the job. Va'achal et kol eitz hatzomeach lachem min hasadeh, everything that's grown from you, every tree they're going to eat. Okay, so that's our bet. Look at what Rav Hirsch says. Rav Hirsch says, what is this ein haaretz? The human eye is called an ayin. And the word ma'ayan is a spring, right? You know, in Hebrew, ma'ayan from the word ayin is a spring, something like, or source. Not because the soul of man flows out of the eye, but because it is through the eye that the world flows into a man. So the eye of man is literally the ein haaretz. When it says here, v'chisa et ein haaretz, Rav Hirsch says, the locusts will cover the eye of the land. No, it's the source of the land as it comes into the person. It's going to cover people's eyes, not literally, but what it means is that the locust will bring about that nothing of the world will penetrate through into the eye of man. The eye will no longer be able to see the earth. The plague of locusts is that they're going to cover the entire earth so that there's nothing to see. So note, the plague before darkness was not a plague of darkness, but it was a plague that even though it's light outside, there's nothing to see. Which, I don't know which is a worse plague, not being able to see or being able to see, but there being nothing there. So that Rav Hirsch brilliantly shows how locusts lead into choshech, lead into darkness. That it starts with nothing to see, it ends with choshech. And to go back to your point, Esther, meaning this is, a metaphorical blindness that's being brought. I mean, it's a real blindness, but it's meant to highlight, I believe, the metaphorical blindness to the evils that they've been committing throughout these many years. If only you would open your eyes. You thought your eyes were open the whole time, and you thought that nothing was there. No, it's just that you weren't seeing it, but it was there. And so Rav Hirsch, I think this is a brilliant interpretation of what the plague was. Because after all, keep in mind, locust is like, it's a nothing of a plague, if you will, because the plague before had just destroyed all the produce. So the locusts are coming in and destroying the remnant. That's not really a major plague if there's only 5% less. So it destroys the last 5%. That 5% wasn't going to sustain them anyway. But it's more than that. It's a plague of darkness before darkness. It's a plague of making sure that even those who could see, even those who didn't have darkness, still had nothing to look at. So that's the teaching this week. Going through Choshech, looking at Rashi, understanding the different aspects of Choshech and why darkness was brought in to kill the evil Israelites as well, and not have the Egyptians suspect God for that, and as well to allow the Israelites a peek at the riches of the Egyptians that they could then borrow upon the Exodus. We saw the Ketav HaKabbalah of Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg asking that excellent question about darkness and about the reality of darkness, how darkness is a real concept, not simply the absence of light. We looked at the Ibn Ezra, which talked about how the Egyptians kept time, and his own experiences on sea, and his ability to understand or to come to this explanation only because of his personal experiences. We saw the Chassam Sofer, who talked about that brilliant question as to why we needed darkness as opposed to simply blindness. And then we looked at Rav Hirsch, who pointed to a different type of darkness without the light ever going away, but still the darkness of the earth being covered and the eye not being able to see what it desires to see, that being a form of darkness as well. That's our Parsha insights for Parshat Bo. Thank you very much for joining us. Wishing
Thank you.
everybody a Shabbat Shalom. It's been a joy.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
We'll see you next week.
Shalom.
Shalom, thank you.
See you next
Very
week.
fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Toda Rabba.
Rabbi, it would be